Hello, guys. How are we doing tonight? It's Mental Health Monday and the first Monday of the new year, and the very first day of the new year. How are we doing? We're going to be diving back into Ben Wolf's Blood Origins tonight. We are continuing with the second Mercenary story. I'm going to start off with a little going backward. I'm going to go backwards here a little bit and read some of the first chapter that we've already read just to sort of catch up and whatnot. What is our drink of choice tonight? Is it a hot beverage? Is it a cold beverage? Mine is a mildly room temperature warm tea right now. I've been drinking on it for a minute. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm gonna dive back in. Blood Mercenaries Origins by Ben Wolf. And this story is the second one in the Mercenaries series. Let me turn my phone on Do Not Disturb here. Okay. So I'm going to cut back to about halfway through chapter 2 here. Who just subscribed? The hubby just subscribed. Hi, baby. Thanks for the subscription. Welcome to the coven once again. Alright, guys, here we go. Kent didn't stop writing until the walls of Renhold Fortress, Marath's southeastern border fortress, loomed on the horizon, just before the setting sun. He looked back. So far, no one was following him that he could see. He had calculated his options during the ride away from his estate. Well, what was his estate? And decided that he had to keep heading south. He would go to Enoth, the one place where they would not follow him, not without risking a full-fledged war. Kent urged his horse forward. He'd told the soldiers at the gate he was heading north to Lord Frostsong's estate. But even though the Etheridges and the Frostsongs had maintained comfortable relations for decades, Lord Frostsong would undoubtedly have Kent killed upon learning of his curse. That was Marath's law, and it was inescapable as long as he remained in the country. No one in Marath would help him. Ranhold Fortress was about 2 miles away now, and Kent took solace in knowing that his arrival would far precede any news regarding his cursed condition or of his father's demise. As such, Kent would still command some measure of power, respect, and even privilege upon his arrival, and he intended to parlay all of that into a good meal and possibly some rest. Fane. That bastard. Kent exhaled a shaky breath. He had hardly taken time to breathe, much less to process what had happened. Sorrow racked his chest, and tears stung the corners of his eyes. I swear, by the gods, I swear I will have my revenge. Kent blinked away his emotions and refocused on his plans. He'd entertained the idea of fleeing to He'd entertained the idea of fleeing to Erythia or Gavalia, two countries that bordered Marath to the northeast and due east, respectively, or of heading due north toward Xenothin, the continent's largest country, part of which bordered Marath in the north, along with the neighboring country of Etrijan. But he'd dismissed those ideas just as quickly. Any of them would mean spending far too much time traversing now hostile territory. Aside from Anath, his only other option was finding a ship on Marath's western coast and boarding it. But where would it take him? Plus, that path would lead him through even more of his home country along the way, and any soldier with a scorelite crystal could quickly identify him as being cursed. As much as he hated to admit it, Anath was his only viable option, and in some ways, his best option. Since Marath and Anath refused to trade or negotiate in any manner, he'd had no contact with anyone of significance within the country. No one there would know him, and in anonymity he could begin a new life. What's more, as a fellow cursed magic user, he would no longer have to hide his abilities, meager as they were. At least the tingling in his fingers might finally normalize once and for all. Kent muttered curses anew upon Fane. Were it not for Fane's lifelong jealousy and deceit culminating the way it had, Kent would be ruling the province instead of trying to flee it. Father hadn't needed to die, particular the way that he'd been killed. Murdered by his own son. Rage boiled in Kent's chest, but he had no way to release any of it. He wished Fane were there with him. Then Kent could wrap his glowing blue hands around Fane's neck and squeeze the life from his body. Someday, Fane will pay for his crimes. Within minutes, he'd closed to within a half-mile of the fortress, and in waning sunlight he could make out the shapes of soldiers patrolling atop both the border wall and the fortress. The sight filled him with nostalgia and sorrow simultaneously, and then the sorrow took over. Kent pushed it all aside. He could deal with his emotions once he was truly safe. A few minutes later, his horse approached the fortress's northern gate. He identified himself to the soldiers on duty and requested that they send General Kalaruk to the wall to confirm his identity. Shortly afterward, a stocky man about Kent's age with black and gray hair and wearing dark bronze armor emerged from the now open portcullis at the gate. General Karuk. 4 soldiers clad in white iron armor flanked him, 2 on each side. Kent urged his horse forward, but didn't dismount. If they somehow knew what had happened, he wanted to be ready to bolt away without any delays. Furthermore, forcing General Kalaruk and his men to look up at him projected a useful air of superiority that he could leverage. "My lord," General Kalaruk rasped. He bowed. "We weren't expecting you." When Kalaruk straightened up, Kent noticed the thick scar that traced from his left cheek down his jaw and down the left side of his throat. Long ago, something, or someone, had carved a remembrance into Kalaruk and damaged his voice in the process, but Kent had never heard the entire story. "Of course not," Kent said. Otherwise, you would have been prepared with a proper welcome. But that is the nature of surprise inspections, General. They are meant to be surprising. Calarook grinned and nodded. I've been known to execute surprise inspections myself from time to time. You can expect to find everything in good order here. I run a tight ship. Kent matched his grin. I know you do, General. Will you escort me inside? It will be my pleasure. The portcullis soon closed behind them, sealing them inside the fortress. Kent passed off his injury as minor wounds he'd sustained while riding to the fortress. He'd claimed he'd scraped against a low-hanging tree branch that gouged his hip. General Calarook had given him a curious eye upon hearing it. He had certainly seen his fair share of wounds throughout the years, and likely doubted the veracity of Kent's tale. But he didn't question it openly, and he made sure Kent received proper care for it. The inspection went well. The soldiers demonstrated attention to detail and thoroughness. Their dedication to developing and maintaining the fortress's rich history of defending against Nothian attacks made Kent proud, albeit a proudness laced with sadness. They prepared a hasty feast in Kent's honor, and all the while General Calarook asked him gentle questions that pinpointed the holes in Kent's story. What happened to your escort? Where are your personal effects? Did you not think to bring warm clothes for your journey? What inspired your choice to carry a common soldier's sword instead of your own? What led you to dress so well for a simple inspection? Kent tactfully answered them all, but he sensed that Calarook understood that something was off. After all, he hadn't risen to the rank of general by being stupid. After the meal concluded, Kent excused himself and allowed Calarook to escort him to the private chambers they'd prepared for him for the evening. They stopped at his door, and Calarook paused with the skeleton key in the lock. He turned toward Kent and rasped, My lord, forgive me for my forwardness, but I know there is more you are not telling me. I only ask you now out of concern that I may need more information in order to best prepare for any potential threats. Is there anything else I need to know? Kent smirked. General, your skills of perception are sharp as ever. There is more to this story, but as my father and I are still developing a plan, we cannot share much more than what I am about to tell you. Calarook turned the key and opened the chamber doors. Perhaps it's best we speak inside. Kent hesitated. Of all the people in Marath, he didn't want to be alone in a room with, particularly under the current circumstances. Calarook ranked near the top of that list. His fighting prowess and tactical mind surpassed that of the majority of the Marathian army's top commanders. What's more, he had insisted on overseeing Ranhold Fortress personally, despite Kent and his father's attempts to move him somewhere more comfortable. Calarook had refused to leave the protection of the southeastern border to anyone else. But Ken obliged. Hi, Puffers. Ah, 9 months. Let's go. Twitch, baby. Mwaha. I need to switch my 9 month emote to the baby emote. That'd be funny. How are you doing tonight, Puff? But Kent obliged him, entered the room first to get a sense of its size and the resources available should he need to make use of them. He saw a bed with simple wooden posts, a wardrobe in the corner, a simple writing desk with a chair, and little else. Calarook shut the door and locked it behind him. Have a seat if you wish, my lord. Kent tried to read Calarook, but he couldn't discern what he was thinking. Calarook's face remained hard, but emotionless, like usual, and his damaged voice didn't betray any audible cues, one way or another. So, Kent pulled the desk chair out and sat down. Calarook sat on the corner of the bed, tucked the key into his left gauntlet, and stared at Kent. I'm doing all right. Still need to get Master Crota done. Oof. Overall, I am just chilling for the night though, and saw you go live. Happy to sit and listen to the stream. May end up knocking out, but this book sounds riveting. Yes, this is the second part of the origins, blood origins here. Um, I haven't done anything with Crota stuff, but I don't have the dungeon key and all that in the season pass to do anything. So I've just been doing plain old weeklies in Destiny, being boring. Thank you again for your hospitality, General, Kent said. Calarook just nodded, interwove his armored fingers on his lap, and kept staring. What I am about to tell you, you must promise not to share with anyone. I am bound by the blood covenant. I swore to Marath and her emperor to respect and obey your lordship. Calarook gave a slight bow. Your wish is my command. I understand. Thank you. Nothing wrong with boring. Better than repetitive content drain. Indeed. Indeed. You getting drained out on it? Have you been running people through it too? Kent took a breath and then launched into a fabrication about how his father suspected Anath had sent spies into Marath to discern their defense capabilities and to assess for weaknesses. Therefore, Kent had personally come to visit the most crucial intersection between the two countries. Oh, how cute, baby. Thanks. Oh, wait, who's bored? Oh, well, now I'm confused. Everybody's bored. No, I did say that I was doing boring stuff on Destiny, which prompted Puff to then say boring stuff. The nothing wrong with boring stuff. Been trying to, but need to get myself out of my own head. But before I can comfortably run folks through it, I agree with place on it. Bullshit, y'all do me too good. It looks like I might actually be able to play you guys the recordings of my show when it comes, at least my snippets. Because the the sound and lights person said that he records everything. Beastie said he records everything. So oh yay, I am gonna be able to at least show you guys my snippets. Um but I won't have other people's permission, nor will it probably be along Twitch guidelines. Cabaret show and all. He developed the tale hours earlier while riding from his family estate toward the fortress, and it rolled off his tongue as smoothly as any lie he'd ever told, though he usually shied away from lying at all. And my task tomorrow will be to infiltrate the kingdom of Anath, so we may glean what information we can about their plans concerning our great nation. Alone? Calarook asked. Kent nodded. Alone. I have been preparing for this day for months. Bringing anyone with me would risk damaging my chances for amenity. Calaruk nodded. They sat there in silence for a long moment. Finally, Calaruk sucked in a sharp, deep breath and, and said, You know, I had hoped it wasn't true. Kent's heart started beating faster. I beg your pardon? Of all the lords I've dealt with in this country, you were by far my favorite. Calaruk's hands separated and rested on his knees. You always treated me with fairness and respect. Your father was a good man, but I always knew you were better. Kent squinted at him. Calaruk had distinctly spoken of Kent's father in the past tense. It wasn't an accident. Thank you. That's why I found it so disconcerting when I received word by Raven this afternoon of what happened at your family's estate this morning. The familiar tingle returned to Kent's fingertips. He clenched his fists. I was aggrieved to hear of your father's untimely demise, and I was even sadder to hear of your brother's succession as Lord Etheridge. Calaruk shook his head. Between you and me, I've always thought he was a wretched, spoiled brat. Kent nodded. So have I. But unfortunately, if the story I read was true, what I think of him doesn't change what I must do now. Calaruk reached for something in his belt, but he hadn't brought in any weapons, at least none that Kent had seen. He still wore his full armor, minus his helmet. Kent doubted he'd been able to conceal any weapons within his bulky armor. Even so, Kent remained on his guard. He'd given up his sword prior to dinner, so he was unarmed. Calaruk extended his arm toward Kent with his hand closed, palm up. Then he opened it. Wow, Calaruk about to do him bogus, guys. A piece of vivid green scorelite lay in his palm. I need you to take hold of this, my lord. Calaruk kept his eyes fixed on Kent, and Kent returned his stare. Then we will know the truth. Kent swallowed. He uttered, I did not kill my father. That, I believe, Calaruk said. But I need to know for sure about the rest. Kent stared at the scorelight for a moment. Then he refocused on Calaruk's hard brown eyes. Please do not make me do this, General. Please, just let me leave. Calaruk shook his head. You lords wrote the laws. I just enforce them. The tingling in Kent's fingers heightened and spread to the entirety of his hands. Very well, General. Please forgive me for having failed you. Kent leaned forward, reached for the scorelight with his left hand, and balanced himself on the edge of his seat by grabbing the top of the chair with his right hand. Then he stood upright and whipped the chair at General Calaruk's head. God damn! He said, No, no, sir, you are not. Full. God damn. You are too modest. Oh yes, that's probably the autism. Well, hell no. Chapter 3. General General Calaruk raised his left arm, and the chair shattered against his shoulder and side rather than his head. The scorelight and broken pieces of wood scattered across the floor and the bed. Unfazed, Calaruk sprung to his feet and charged Kent, who sidestepped a little too late. Calarook's right arm caught Kent's waist, and they both hit the floor in a mass of well dressed and well armored fury. Amid the scramble, Kent smashed his elbow into Calarook's cheek, and it earned him a brutal headbutt to his chest. The air pushed out of Kent's lungs, and he struggled to breathe as he found his footing and tried to back away. Calarook pursued him and lunged forward again. Kent tried to sprawl, but the force of Calarook's attack kept him upright. Kent's back smacked into the wall next to the wardrobe, and he grunted and moaned and sucked for air. They fought for positioning, and Kent managed to grab Calarook's head with his hands and anchor it between his forearms. Kent pushed forward with his torso and forced Calarook upright for the first time in the scuffle. Then Kent pulled him back and drove his right knee into the armor covering his belly. A dull clunk sounded, and Calarook expelled a sharp breath. Kent seized his chance. He yanked Calarook's head to the right and kicked at his ankles with his right leg. The head motion set Calarook off balance, and the kick swept his feet out from under him. Kent let him go, and Calarook hit the floor on his side with an armored clank. The wardrobe. Calarook was laying right in front of it. Kent grabbed the top of it and hauled it down. It slammed on top of Calarook with a loud crash, and Kent had to wonder if more soldiers might come to Calarook's aid because of the noise. One thing Kent had learned in all his decades of fighting training was to press an advantage whenever he had one. So he did. Kicking Calarook's armored ribs wouldn't afford Kent anything except broken toes, so Kent aimed elsewhere. As Calarook hefted the wardrobe off of him, Kent delivered a hard kick to his exposed head. The blow struck hard, and it stunned Calarook for an instant, long enough for Kent to drop down and pin him to the floor. Pain smashed into Kent's forehead, and he rolled off of Calarook to recover. Calarook had bashed him with one of the wardrobe's doors. Kent hurried to his feet and dabbed at his head. His fingers came back red and wet, but he realized the tingling had subsided, just as it had during his fights with the guards and his brother back at the manse. Calarook got to his feet as well and flung the door at Kent, who dove to the side to avoid getting hit. When he reset, Calarook had reached him and wrapped his arms around Kent's waist. The pressure pinched the bandaged cut on his hip, and he winced. Kent tried to squat down to counter, but Calarook proved too strong. He hefted Kent off his feet, twisted and arched his back, and drove Kent into the floor. These mans are straight out just WWE in here, bro. The blow racked the bones in Kent's arms and shoulders, and Calarook's body weight kept Kent struggling to breathe. Calarook pinned Kent on his back, mounted him, and bared his bloody teeth. He raised his right arm to throw a punch. Kent shifted hard to his right and pumped his knees into Calarook's back. The force sent Calarook's punch careening wide, and Kent wrapped his arm around Calarook's head, anchoring it close to his shoulder. It gave him a moment to breathe, but it didn't last long. Calarook twisted and reared back up. Kent's red cape lay half under his own body and half to his right side. He could use it if he could get enough of it in his hands. Calarook readied himself for another punch. Kent performed the same evasion as before, only this time he didn't try to hold Calarook's head down with his arm. Instead, he wrapped a length of the cape around Calarook's head and fed it to his other hand. Then he wrapped it around again. When Calarook straightened up, the cape slipped down from around his face to under his chin, around his neck. Kent pulled it and adjusted his grip until it tightened around Calarook's thick neck. Purple-faced Calarook pulled on the cape at first. Then he changed tactics and dropped his elbow on Kent's nose. The blow hurt, but it failed to loosen Kent's grip. Instead, Kent pulled tighter, adjusted his grip again, and kept his elbows and forearms near his head to better protect himself. Calarook dropped a few more elbows, all of which Kent deflected, and then he resorted back to pulling at the cape. He should have just done that all along. Kent had no room to his right, so he had planted his left foot just on the outside of Calarook's right foot, braced his forearms against Calarook's bronze chest, and shoved hard up into the left with his torso and his hips. Calarook's stocky body toppled over, and Kent tightened the cape further, now from the top. Kent pressed his advantage. God damn, these guys are going at it. He cleared Calarook's legs, got on his side, and used his shoulder and one temporarily free hand to roll Calarook onto his side. Then Kent got behind him, hooked his legs around Calarook's ample waist, and yanked with all his might. Calarook's hands fought the cape, and he snorted and gurgled, but before long, his hands slipped down to his sides. By now, his whole head had turned purple, like one massive bruise. If Kent wanted to kill him, all he had to do was keep the pressure consistent for about another minute. Not much effort at all. But doing so would leave the fortress in far worse shape and less prepared to defend itself against incursions from Anoth. Then again, Anoth was about to become Kent's new home. Perhaps Murath, the country that had both borne him and branded him for execution, deserved whatever it got. But General Calarook didn't deserve to die. Kent sighed, and he released his grip on Calarook's neck. He unwrapped his cape, and a labored breath sucked into Calarook's mouth and nostrils. Kent pushed him to the side and stood. The choke had put Calarook to sleep, but he would eventually wake up disoriented, and he'd miss the time that he had passed since he went out. Kent needed to leave before that happened. He fished the room key out of Calarook's left gauntlet and headed toward the door. He caught sight of a mirror on his way out, and he used his red cape to wipe some of the blood from his face. It didn't help much, but it would have to do. Kent left the room and locked Calarook inside. If anyone in the fortress had the strength to break out by sheer will, it was Calarook, but it would take even him some time to manage the feat, especially while weakened and confused once he woke up. With the key in hand, Kent headed down the corridor toward the exit. He made his way into the fortress's courtyard, reoriented himself to the surroundings, and headed for the south gate. Once he passed through it, he'd be in Anoth, and he'd be safe. Relatively. What do I tell the soldiers? Cold air chilled his face and hands, and once again, his breath exhaled as vapor. As he approached the gate, he realized he didn't have the horse he'd stolen from his own estate. There's no time. You're already in too much danger. It was true. He would have to make his way on foot. He reached the portcullis, and the ranking soldier on duty gawked at him. Lord Etheridge, what happened? Kent opted for honesty. General Calarook attacked me. I overcame him and locked him in my chambers. By the gods, I'm glad you're unharmed. The soldier looked him over. Mostly. Send men to tend General Calarook, then raise the portcullis. The soldier's back straightened. My lord? Raise the portcullis now, soldier. My lord, it's clear you're unwell. You're poorly dressed for the elements, and we never open the portcullis after dark, for safety reasons. Why, if I may ask, do you want us to do such a thing? Because I am going out. I am on a secret mission from my father, and I am not to be hindered in any way, Kent said slowly, menacingly. Open the gate. The soldier gulped. Then he relayed the order. Kent checked behind him as the portcullis rose, but no one came for him, including General Calarook. When the portcullis reached halfway up, Kent handed the soldier the key. If your men cannot otherwise get inside those chambers, here is the key. The soldier took it and stared at Kent with confusion etched on his face. Wish me good fortune, soldier, Kent asked. I wish you all the good fortune this world has to offer, my lord. He gave a slight bow. Kent ducked under the portcullis and headed into the darkness beyond the fortress. All the while, he wondered if that soldier's wishes were the last kind words he would ever hear from one of his countrymen. When Kent awoke the next morning, the blood from his head had dried and crusted on the side of his face, and the blood from his nose had crusted over the left half of his chapped lips. He worked his finger along his top row of teeth and separated his lips carefully, and then he smacked his lips together a few times to get them working again. He'd fallen asleep under a tree some 3 miles from Runhold Fortress, now hidden from his view thanks to a series of hills and the small forests that surrounded him. His cape had done just enough to keep him warm the night before, but now, in the morning light, he could see how stained and soiled it and the rest of his clothes were. He took his time getting to his feet, in part because he wasn't in any rush to begin his new life, but mostly because his body ached all over from the last day's travails. At his age, his body took far longer to recover than it used to. Kent intended to give it as much time as it needed to accomplish that feat. Some time later, he pushed himself up to his feet, and his body ached anew. His head swam and pounded for a moment, then it equalized and gave him a respite from its harassment. He leaned against the tree for a few minutes while he collected himself, cursing Fane all the while. But with each new strife Kent endured, his resolve to kill Fane further ingrained itself in his will, in his very being. His brooding done, Kent stretched his sore limbs and started walking south. Father had many times mused aloud at the possibility of invading northern Anoth with a large Father had many times mused aloud at the possibility of invading northern Anoth with a large, organized force, but he'd never acted on the impulse. Neither had Emperor Bowen, Morath's ruler. As such, Kent had only been to Anoth a handful of times, and always with a small army accompanying him, so he didn't really have any sense of where he was going. He decided to just head south until he happened upon something man-made, a farm, a road, a town, and figure it out from there. As long as he avoided Anoth's northern fortresses, he would be fine. Half a day later, he saw a farmhouse in the distance. He headed toward it. Rather than stopping in and petitioning for aid, he visited the water trough set out for the livestock and used the frigid water to clean off his face and hands. The animals likely wouldn't be pleased, but he didn't revel in having to use their water to clean himself either. He left the farm shortly after and found a road, more like a path, with a couple of ruts, and he followed it for another 2 hours. The midday sun went from warming him to baking him, and then back to warming him again as he walked. Another hour later, he happened upon a good-sized town, and he ventured into it. He got no shortage of strange looks from the townspeople, probably his 2-day-old clothes in their bedraggled condition, or perhaps their initial quality and decadence, especially compared to what everyone else was wearing, set him apart. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, with short brown hair, wandered up to him. "What happened to your face?" Or that. Kent crouched down and looked the lad in his dark green eyes. "I got into a fight." The boy's eyes widened. "Did you win?" Kent grinned. "Just barely." The boy smiled, then he turned and ran off. Kent hadn't eaten since the night before, and now it was early afternoon. A few shops, street vendors, and a local inn seemed to offer food, But Kent had no coin. He hadn't had time to grab anything from his personal coffers at the manse, and he'd brought nothing from the fortress aside from the clothes on his back. Ultimately, Kent managed to trade his cape, ruined as it was, for a good meal and a sack of fruit that he could carry as he walked. As the vendor stuffed the sack with apples and oranges, Kent wondered whether or not she was cursed as well. After all, he was in an off. Yet, strangely, he hadn't seen anyone using magic in any capacity since he'd arrived. Hundreds of years earlier, Marath and Anoth had been one nation that became embroiled in a civil war. The Southerners had aligned to form a nation of magic users, and the Northerners, who relied on traditional weapons of war, tried to prevent their secession. In the end, the Southerners prevailed. Anoth formed in spite of its parent country, Marath, and all Marathian magic users fled to the south under penalty of death. Little had changed since then, except that Marath had developed a much stronger military as a result. The small town had little to offer him, and it was still far too close to the Marathian border for his liking. Perhaps if he headed farther south to Goldmoor, Anoth's capital city, he'd find some sense of purpose. What's more, a bigger city meant he'd disappear more easily. Now, above all else, amenity was his friend. So Kent asked the vendor for his directions to the capital, and he got the information he needed. Then he set out towards Goldmoor, hoping his meager sack of fruit would last the full 3-day walk. Let's see what happens in Anoth. I wonder if magic is actually being used as often as Marathians think, or if this is sort of more of a propaganda type thing against, the magic users and whatnot. Give me just a second. I'm gonna be right back. Okay? Okay. Little Eyes is back. Peppers. Nope, you gotta stay down. Nope. In 3 days, excuse me. In 3 days' time, Kent arrived at the western gates of Goldmoor with no more fruit and no more sack. He'd washed himself and his clothes in an icy stream along the way, but he still felt poor. He'd washed himself and his clothes in an icy stream along the way, but he still felt poor. There was no other way to describe it. Then again, he was poor now, in every sense of the word. Yet, as much as he longed for the comforts of his home in Marath, he would have given it all away to have found a way to save his father and to kill his brother. From what Kent had observed, the soldiers at the city's western gate allowed people to walk in and out, generally without bothering them. But on occasion, they would stop travelers and ask them questions. Kent expected he'd be stopped, and he had prepped a story in advance, should it happen. He opted to walk the extra half day to reach the city's western gate, precisely to help avoid suspicion. Entering the city's northern gates would cast his story into doubt due to the gate's relative proximity to Marath, so the extra travel time made sense, tactically, to mitigate the risk. Sure enough, as Ken approached, a pair of low-ranking soldiers clad in brown leather breastplates and matching greaves stopped him. "You look tired, traveler," the first soldier said. Kent studied them both from top to bottom. He could see no weapons on either of them. But then again, he was in Anoth now. The Anothian army relied on the use of magic to fight, so Kent assumed these soldiers could handle themselves without the aid of weapons. He did, however, notice little pouches hanging along their belts. Kent had seen comparable pouches up close only a handful of times before, on captured Anothian soldiers near Marath's southern border, but he still didn't know what purpose they served. Whenever his men had captured an Anothian and searched him, they only found nature's cast-offs in those pouches. Grass, leaves, sticks, pebbles, and the like. Tell me you don't know nothing about witchcraft without telling me you don't know nothing about witchcraft. Oh, hell no. "I'm talking to you, guy," the first soldier said. Kent smiled. "Forgive me, sir. I have had a long journey, and I am indeed tired." "You've got a strange accent." The second soldier stepped closer, his hands on his hips. "Where are you from?" "Northern Eurythia." Kent had chosen the country based on its distance from Anoth. He figured few common folk would ever had had occasion to travel so far from home. So it sounded like a bait. He figured few common folk would ever had occasion to travel so far from home, so it seemed like a safe bet. And since Anoth and Eurythia had maintained peaceful terms for decades, these soldiers likely wouldn't have been sent there for any reason either. "Certainly explains your ridiculous clothing," the first soldier said. "A long way from home, aren't you?" the second soldier asked. "Alone and without so much as a pack?" "I ran into bandits on my way here," Kent lied. They were wow. They were magnanimous enough to let me keep my clothes, but nothing else." "What did they look like?" The second soldier's eyes narrowed. "Like bandits?" Kent sensed that wouldn't be enough, so he added, "It was dark. I couldn't see them well. My vision isn't what it used to be." The soldiers had to be at least 15 years younger than Kent, so playing up his old man status seemed wise. The first soldier nodded. "Not much to be done about it, but you could report the incident to the constable if you like." "I just reported it to you." "We just work the gate, sir," the first soldier said. "We don't deal with anything beyond these walls, as per our sign posting." "The constable won't do anything either, to be honest." The second soldier had loosened up a bit, and now his hands hung at his sides instead of resting on his hips, near those pouches. "No sense getting your hopes up. Your property's long gone by now. Best to accept it and move on." "You got any You got any friends in the city who can help you out? The first soldier asked. Kent shook his head. He could tell the truth for this one. Not a soul. And I assume they took your coin as well. Kent nodded. Here. The first soldier dug into one of his pouches and produced a few small copper coins. He extended them toward Kent. It's not much, but it should buy you a warm meal at least. Maybe even a room for the night. Kent accepted the coins and marveled at them. This soldier, this man who'd been the embodiment of his sworn enemy less than a week earlier, had just given his own coin to help ensure Kent's well being. Yet, Kent's own father had disowned him. His brother had tried to have him arrested and executed, and General Calarook had tried to kill him. The vast difference between the two sets of experiences left him stunned. Thank you, Kent managed to say. And be sure to stop by the Temple of Lair. They can help you more. Wait, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Lair. Larry, I'm going to have to email Ben on that one too. Laeri. And be sure to stop by the Temple of Larry. They can help you more. Larry, the goddess of light? The same. The first soldier grinned. You worship her up in northern Eurythia as well? Not a question Kent had wholly prepared for, but I worship her wherever I am. You'll be right at home then, the first soldier gave him a nod. Now, sir, if you don't mind, we ought to inquire of some other travelers. Go on into the city, if you still wish. Kent nodded to them both, and he repeated, Thank you. Then he went inside. He'd heard that Anoth's capital city got its name from the vivid sunrises seen from its harbors. Given that it was afternoon now, Kent resigned himself that he would view it eventually. He'd be living here indefinitely, so he had plenty of time to explore later. The city rose before him to the north, gradually elevating on a steady slope, but it lowered to sea level in the east and south. High above, a series of white stone spires loomed over the rest of the city. He guessed it was Hunera Palace, where Anoth's queen resided. Goldmoor bustled with people of all shapes and sizes, not unlike Maroth's capital city, Drian. But in many ways, Kent liked it better than Drian. He especially liked being near the sea. The warm, salty air filled him with hope. As instructed, he asked around and made his way to the Temple of Lari, a massive pillared structure made of sleek black stone. Kent marveled at it as he approached, and he wondered why a temple of light would be made of black stones. But inside the temple, an all-white sanctuary greeted him. White walls, white floors, a white altar, white tapestries hung from the walls, and white light streamed through the crystalline ceiling. A white statue of Lari towered over the altar with her hands extended out to her sides, palms up, majestic and beautiful. But a dark circle hollowed out the center of her chest, just under her covered breasts. The statue vaguely resembled the icons of Lari he'd seen in comparable temples in Marath. Behind her, a massive marble triangle framed the altar, with its lower point down and the upper points spread wide beyond Lari's head. He wondered at the possible symbolism of the design aesthetic. Was it a metaphor for the outside world, as compared to that of a life of dedication to the goddess of Lari? Or had black stones simply been more economically to purchase, given that Hunera Palace was made of white stones? Whatever the case, Kent gathered with a group of others inside the temple and repeated the liturgy and incantations spoken by the priestess in pure white robes embroidered with a Whatever the case, Kent gathered with a group of others inside the temple and repeated the liturgy and incantations spoken by the priestess in pure white robes, embroidered with star and triangle shapes. It almost matched the ceremonies in Marathian temples to Lari, except for a few minor deviations. Then again, he hadn't attended any type of ceremony in years. He couldn't claim even remote expertise in this area. But as the ceremony concluded, the priestess raised her hands over her head and looked towards the crystalline ceiling. She put her left hand into the stream of light, now angled toward the temple's eastern wall, thanks to the setting sun, and she closed her eyes. When she pulled her hand away from the stream, the light still clung to her hand, and an arc of light traced from the stream of sunlight down to where she lowered her hand and hung in the air. Then she molded the light into a small orb, twice as bright as the streams of sunlight. Kent watched the sight in awe. He'd seen plenty of forms of magic in his days of fighting Anothians, but he'd never seen anyone manipulate light itself before. The priestess turned back towards the image of Larry and raised her hands again, this time with the orb glowing between them. She released it, and it hovered in the air over her head. Then it slowly rose up to Larry's chest and lodged in the hollow, dark circle under her breasts. As it did, the statue itself began to glow, but not on its own. The orb was casting light throughout the statue, and millions of microscopic cracks glowed with the warm afternoon sunlight the priestess had captured. Incredible. And an incredible tribute to the goddess of light. Kent wondered how the priestess had managed such a feat, but more so, he wondered what practical value the magic had outside of illuminating a statue. He didn't get a chance to ask the priestess. She walked behind the statue of Larry and disappeared, possibly into a back room. Kent caught a temple worker afterward and tried to get a meeting with the priestess, but the temple worker refused to accommodate him. So Kent explained what the soldier had told him, and the temple worker escorted him through the temple to a separate chamber. Kent found himself standing among dozens of foul-smelling, disheveled people, waiting in some sort of line. He surveyed the room and realized he'd stumbled into some sort of communal sleeping room. Unlike the pristine whiteness of the sanctuary, this chamber housed simple wooden beds, stacked 3 high and spaced no more than a few feet apart. The line curled around the beds to a wooden table set up at the far side of the room. Another temple worker, distinct because of his white robes, sat at the table and scribbled on a piece of parchment for each person who approached. Then the person at the front of the line would leave and meander through the forest of beds. After what looked like intentional searching, the person would claim one. Kent realized the beds were numbered. He'd slept outdoors for nearly a week, and while he would have preferred not to share sleeping quarters with dozens of filthy street people, it beat actually becoming one of those filthy street people by sleeping on the street that night. And with winter drawing to a close, the nights were still cold, even so much farther south than Marath. So Kent sighed and resigned himself to his fate. The line took a little less than an hour to get through, and Kent climbed to bed. Number 268, a bottom spot. Shortly after he did, the doors to the chamber closed, and no one else was let in, despite much shouting and complaining coming from just outside. The temple's shelter service must have capped around 300 beds. Temple workers ushered the human mass into another larger chamber, sat them at worn wooden tables like the one where Kent had received his bed number, and fed them a hot, albeit bland, meal. Better than an empty stomach. Back in the chamber of beds, Kent made his way back to number 268. When he got there, a large, bare-chested man was laying in it. The man was chatting at a young woman in the next bed over who appeared as if she wanted nothing to do with either him or the conversation they were having. Excuse me, sir, Kent said to him, but I believe you have the wrong bed. The man looked up at him with brown eyes so dark they were almost black. Piss off! Then he resumed his talking. Kent squared himself with the bed. I said, you have the wrong bed, sir. The man looked up at him again. And I said, piss off. I apologize, but I will not be doing that. Now, will you comply nicely, or must you be made to cooperate? The man scoffed. Then he rolled out of bed and stood to his full height, a good 6 inches taller than Kent. His skin carried a grayish, ashen pallor, albeit faint and pallor. His skin carried a grayish, ashen pallor, albeit faint and black. Bristly hair sprouted from his chest, arms, neck, face, and shoulders. Kent imagined it must have carried over to his back as well, but he decided he'd rather not know for sure. He's scared? Okay. His scarred face seemed swine like in shape, and when he spoke, his teeth looked abnormally large for his mouth. He looked strong, but in an unrefined way. His thick arms lacked tone, and under his sagging chest muscles, his gut lolled over his belt. Still, he had to weigh a solid 70 pounds more than Kent, and in a fight, that would make a considerable difference. Avoiding a scuffle, if possible, was Kent's prerogative, but if no one were to start, he would end it quickly. Who in the third hell do you think you're talking to? He growled. Kent wrinkled his nose. The man's breath stank like day-old, half-digested mead and rancid meat. Perhaps I was not clear, Kent said calmly. I do not care who you are. I only care that you remove yourself from the bed allotted to me for this evening. The man's mouth opened and he blinked. Then he carried on as if Kent hadn't said anything. I'm Trag Gadzag. You must be new in town if you don't know who I am. Is he slow in the head? I simply require my allotted bed. Please step aside. No one tells me what to do. I'm the best fighter the dockmaster's ever seen. Definitely slow. But if he was telling the truth about his status among fighters down by the docks, then Kent had cause for concern. Kent had engaged in only a few street fights in his day, nearly all of them as a youth. But he'd learned one thing through his extensive combat training over the years. Street fighters usually didn't know much about actual technique. However, many had more tenacity and even dedicated soldiers, and that made them dangerous. But Kent had handled far worse in his day. Trag. Trag, as in tragic. Tragic. Is that your full name? Trag squinted at him. No, just Trag. Trag Gadzag. Kent shook his head. No, I am certain it is short for tragic. With a face like yours, that name is perfect. The young woman Trag had been talking to stifled a giggle, but she slid off her bed and watched from behind it. Trag's fists tightened, and his pitiful chest puffed. You're gonna pay for that. By now, a loose crowd had encircled them. Their presence had all but necessitated that Trag chose to fight, especially since Kent had publicly damaged his ego. Kent was ready for it. As the smaller man, he had the advantage of speed and added mobility in a smaller space. Last chance, friend, Kent said calmly. Walk away, and I will have my bed, and you may return to yours. Trag smacked his chest with his right hand 3 times, loosed a pig like roar, and swung a big overhand right at Kent's head. And that is where we are going to end tonight, on that cliffhanger of what's going to happen next with the fight. Um, my schedule is still kind of up in the air as we get settled into the new year, the new store, and my show coming up. Um, I will keep you guys all updated in Discord as usual. Let us go see who is live. Let's go see who's live. Who should we drop into? Raka's doing Master Beauty challenges. French fries. Playing some Call of Duty. Who should we drop into? French fries or Raka? Let's go drop into French fries again. We shall drop into the French fries. I'm ready, guys. Here are sub. Yeah, there we go. Sub raids and regular raid prompts there for you to follow or to copy and paste. That should work. I hope so. I just changed some of mine for Christmas. I just forgot. So I hope that works. Mwahaha. Alright, let's go say hi to French fries. It is. Alrighty, folks. I will see you next time.